So just to welcome everyone, if you're out there and you've never attended one of our readings before, just a quick overview of the format. Francine and I will introduce ourselves, and then Francine will begin a brief reading from her short story, The Arnolfinis, and then we'll come back to a conversation. And at any point during that conversation, please feel free to write in questions. You can send in questions through the chat function, through the Q&A option. We'll be able to see your questions regardless of where you send it, and I will make sure to fold your questions into the conversation throughout the process. So you definitely don't have to wait until the story is done to start joining us in the discussion. Please feel free to contribute questions, comments, as often and as frequently as you would like. So maybe just to start, Francine, my name is Jan Van Eyck, and I'm very excited to have this conversation with you. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Francine Prose, and I'm really delighted to have this conversation with you.
And today you're going to read from something pretty new.
Yeah, it's pretty new. It's a short story called The Arnolfinis, and it's based on, is the image up? We don't know. It's based on, it's from a series of stories, we'll talk about this a little more later, that each of which is based on an art image, an art historical image usually. So this is a story that's loosely based, as you'll hear, on Jan Van Eyck's famous painting, there we go, famous painting, The Marriage of Jan, famous mysterious painting, The Marriage of Jan Arnolfini. Okay, so I'm just going to read a couple of pages and then we'll start. On the night before the painter came, she dreamed that her husband was a weasel. Not just any weasel, but the Weasel King. In the courtyard of their Montauk house, his weasel army, box cutters clutched in their paws, sprawled about, asleep on the ground like the soldiers guarding the tomb of Jesus. Weasel servants in uniform passed silver trays of tea and elaborately iced cakes, while out in the tulip garden, rebel weasels dangled from gallows. Then she was back in their Manhattan apartment, awake. Or was she? 41 stories below, beggar weasels chanted loud enough to be heard, sugar and meat and corn and meat. Their high-pitched keening woke her. Their bedroom was cold, which her husband liked. Their blanket was fur, another of his kinks that she went along with fine. But now, when she pulled the covers over her shoulders, she felt as if a weasel was stretched the length of her body, covering her, pressing down her chest, breathing into her mouth. She screamed. Hush, he said, Elisabetta. That was the name of his first wife, his beloved dead wife, the wife who had never once been mentioned after their first date, the get-to-know-you dinner that cemented whatever old school agreement her husband and father had come to concerning her future. Go back to sleep, she said. Her husband was rich enough, and thanks to her interest in art history and contemporary art, he should have been, by osmosis, savvy enough to hire an art star, a rising young painter who could be persuaded to do the occasional portrait. Considering what her husband was worth, they could have gotten Jeff Koons. But when anything touched on family tradition, even the imaginary family tradition of the imaginary family, her husband turned into his imaginary parents or grandparents or great-great-grandparents, the ancestors he wished he had and half pretended he had. She had never met his family. He wanted a portrait from another era, the husband and wife in evening wear and formally posed, the wife in an uncomfortable chair, the husband standing behind her, decorously touching her shoulder, or the wife standing behind the husband, touching his shoulder against a background of clouds, the whole scene bathed in the pastel gauze of whiteness, cost, and privilege, the ether of the 1%. Proudly unstylish, that was the point, or that was part of the point. Okay, let's take it away.
Right. So that was from the very start of the story. I kept thinking there are all these different sort of entry points into this narrative, right? There's this image and the relationship the text might have to the image that's sort of there, but you don't actually give us that relationship right away. You actually sort of withhold exactly how this painting is connected to these characters, but something else, almost something very sort of fairy tale like, starts creeping into the story right away, almost even before we know exactly how the narrative connects to Van Eyck's painting. So I wonder if we could talk about that, like the sources of inspiration for the story that weren't only the painting, but perhaps things that came outside of the painting.
Right. Well, as we talked about a little earlier, the reason for the story, the way the story came about, was that I got this kind of great job from Gagosian. The gallery has a magazine, or had a magazine called Gagosian the Magazine. And I got a job from them, a great assignment, which was to write, they're quarterly. So they wanted me to write a short story, one per quarter, so 4 a year. And the only requirement was that it have something to do with art history, or with a visual image, an art visual image. And it was great because first of all, it was an assignment, and having an assignment is, as you know, very liberating. It's not you in a way. And the thing that made it really great was I knew exactly, and I mean exactly, 3 people in the world that got Gagosian magazine. So it was super. So it was super private. I mean, it was like I was doing it for myself, and maybe
Yeah.
these 3 people, if they even knew it was there. So it was it was almost like having a pseudonym, except that it was me. And the stories turned out to be weirdly fun and easy to write. And each one, they were all different. I mean, one was about a Renaissance painter of clouds. One was about cave art. One was about a photographer who specialized in kind of heart-wrenching pictures of children in war-torn areas. That, I mean, she was hired by people who raise money for charities. And then the fourth was about the first cave painter. It was about cave painting. So they all came with these images. So then when I finished it, a year was over, I'd done my 4, and I just couldn't stop doing them. I got into them. So this was the first one I wrote after those 4, because partly also because this painting, I'd always been fascinated by this painting. It's such a crazy, mysterious painting. Books have been written about this painting. No one understands this painting, and it's so beautiful. I mean, in fact, a friend of mine, a painter, said there used to be, on the back of the New York Times Magazine section, there used to be an ad for one of these like learn at home courses you could get from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it had this painting on it. And she was a kid, and she was so fascinated by this painting that she became a painter. So it had, the painting has a huge appeal. And as I started writing the stories, I began to notice these, the way you do these kind of strange connections between and among the stories. I mean, they just kind of happened on their own, that I didn't plan. So there are things in this story that you wouldn't know were connected to the other stories unless you'd read the other stories. But all the stories, for example, have clouds in them, and dogs, and also all the stories, because really they're about art. I mean, they're all about art. They're all about making art. So all the stories have some kind of strange supernatural thing that happens in the story. That, the cliche is the thing wrote itself, or it painted itself, or whatever. Well, it actually happens in these stories. Something happens that's not predictable or scientifically explicable, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of that was sort of the genesis of this story.
Yeah, there's the sense of the sort of creepingly sort of surreal like qualities begin to kind of, I mean, they're there in the beginning of the story, right? The story begins with a dream. It begins with this sort of very sort of tactile dream of a weasel king and the sort of the beggar weasels below. So it's already kind of suggesting something that's sort of outside of the normal realm of sort of traditional realism or reality. And then it seems to sort of, move even sort of deeper into that as the narrative progresses. And a part of me, I was thinking just also too about the way the kind of almost fantastic operates inside of this story, right? Because it's not only as a break from reality, but also at times I was wondering if you were thinking of just the way the story seems to echo some like fairy tales, right? I was thinking about this woman locked up in a tower 41 stories above the city, kind of looking down with the Weasel King and and all the sort of sumptuous, elegant, luxurious sort of qualities that surround her life. in the dream, it's the cakes and the crumpets, the blankets of fur, all of those things that seem to be kind of both real and yet at the same time can also be attributed to the sort of fairy tale reality.
Yeah. Well, in fact, the fairy tale that goes through her mind is Bluebeard, which it turns out not to be. I mean, that turns
Yeah.
out to be the wrong fairy tale for the
Okay.
story. But they all do. I mean, I wanted them all to be kind of old-fashioned narratives like fairy tales with all the kind of turns and weird twists that fairy tales have. And also because it was so liberating to write these stories on assignment and without a readership, as far as I knew, that that I was experimenting in each one. I mean, even though they seem like conventional stories, in this one I was experimenting. For example, uh, the the husband and wife don't have names. I mean,
Yeah.
the dead wife has a name, but they don't have names. I mean, one of the other stories in the same series is the only really or one of the two contemporary ones, and it's about this kind of young art couple in Chelsea who were successful and then not so successful. And the experiment in that one was to give them both gender neutral or without non-binary first names, and then not to use any gender specific pronoun in the entire story. So they're all the way through the story. You never knew if the two hot young painters were male or female, and it didn't matter. But it was an experiment. I mean, it was just to see if that could work. Because again, once you're sort of liberated from the burden of being you and writing like you, all these things happen that you don't expect. And even as I was writing something and things were happening that I didn't expect, the stories turned out to be about things that were happening that people don't expect.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit more about the things that are sort of, because the story also has it is kind of also rooted very much in our sort of world, right? There they are in their sort of opulent Manhattan apartment with their house in the Hamptons, Montauk, and it clearly makes references to a kind of decadence of a sort of 1%, right? What's that wonderful line? To be bathed, the ether, the whole scene
Either of the
bathed in
1%.
sense, yeah, which is obviously something that's sort of very pressing on the way we see the world right now, right? And that term, the 1%, is something that we relate very much with our own, current socioeconomic conversation about the privileged versus the unprivileged. So I was wondering, yeah, how the kind of surreal elements of the story began to also collide or sort of, relate to the very kind of also real contemporary issues that are sort of here.
Well, one thing I was thinking about a lot was the idea of doing portraits on commission. I mean, the Van Eyck was done on commission by Arnolfinis, who was a businessman of some sort. And then I started thinking about the kinds of portrait on commissions that the 1% does now. So either they can have, if they can afford it, Jeff Koons or whomever, or there's this sort of, as she says at the beginning, that sort of old school painting, we've all seen them, where the couple are wearing evening dress, and it's sort of like a bad sergeant or something. You know what I'm talking? I mean, they're posed in that way, and everybody, it's all sort of floaty and cloudy. So I was thinking about those two kinds of image juxtaposed together, the desired painting and then the painting that comes out of it.
And the painting that they desired, to go back to the Van Eyck painting, there is, as you said, something sort of very mysterious and enigmatic about that particular image. But at the same time, the image is also like this couple sort of loaded with all these trappings of wealth, right? From the oranges and the fruit and the bed, the cloth. There's a elaborate display of wealth going on inside of that portrait, and I was wondering if the couple's trying to sort of recreate that sense of that, what they're connected to across the sort of lineage isn't necessarily, by names or by families, but they're perhaps connected by wealth, right? That they don't, the husband doesn't have a name, ancestors, but he has the sort of privilege that perhaps he's trying to attach himself to.
Yeah, he has the privilege to get his portrait painted, but
Yeah.
he's so clueless and he knows so little about art that even when it becomes obvious a little later in the story that the painter, the strange, mysterious painter, is setting up the props and the costuming to do a kind of recreation of the Van Eyck, he has no idea what's going on. And she kind of gets it. I mean, she thinks it's a joke. I mean, she thinks it's kind of a joke, but the husband never understands all the way through what the painter was doing. So in a way, it becomes a kind of secret between her and the painter that the husband's never in on until kind of the final twist in the story.
Does that connect at all to you, to the female character in the Van Eyck painting? There's all sorts of different ways of trying to interpret what her role is. If she's, I know, some sort of idea that she's pregnant when she's probably not. But yeah, how did you see her, that actual character?
Well, I don't think, I don't think she has a name. It's
No.
Jan Arnolfini and his wife. It's the same
Yeah.
thing. She's just there. And also she looks, as we all know, up to be about 12 years old, which wouldn't have been that unusual at the time. And maybe she's pregnant, or maybe that's just how women's costumes were at that time. So, but again, everything in the painting is a kind of, in the Van Eyck painting is a kind of mystery. I mean, there's even the little dog and stuff. There's a mistake in the story, which I didn't really think about till last night when I reread it to try and remember. There's a mistake in the story, which is that in the Van Eyck painting, there's that round mirror in the
Yeah.
background. And in the Van Eyck painting, you can kind of see the painter's reflection in the mirror, the way you can in the Velázquez Las Meninas painting. But I forgot to do that. I forgot to put it into my story. So I think one more revision, and I'm going to have the actual painter's reflection in that round mirror, because we need it.
Yeah, well, because in the Van Eyck painting, the presence of Van Eyck, his name is even sort of etched on the wall, right? Van Eyck was sort of here. It's almost like he tagged his own painting and was like, sort of declaring his essential sort of role in the authorship of it. And I'm wondering what that sort of does to the idea of these characters, and the idea that what they're doing is having their portrait painted, right? That the painting is somehow supposed to be a reflection of them. And yet, even in Van Eyck, it's clearly essential that the artist is also sort of reminding the viewer that, yeah, this might be a couple that I'm painting, but he's very much the lens through which we see these figures, right? And you as the authors being very much the sort of painter through which we see these characters.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, also the other thing that I was thinking about writing all these stories, and maybe this one in particular, was the way in which, and I've been thinking a lot about it, for obvious reasons too, is the way in which art kind of functions as a link between the living and the dead, which is in every sort of way. I mean, for example, presumably Jan Arnolfini and his wife have been dead for I don't know what, 600 years or something, but there they are in the painting. And in the story, it's the presence of the dead wife who appears very early in the story. And then her presence, or her ghost or whatever, hovers very near over the story. And then you don't realize how near it's been hovering over the story until the very end of the story, almost the very end of the story.
I wonder if we should maybe take a couple minutes and go and pick up the story from where we were reading.
Okay. One such portrait of his first wife, the dead wife, hung in the spare bedroom in the city. The first wife had been blonde and, in her successor's opinion, a bit horsey, somewhat slow, with innocent blue eyes that gazed trustingly into the future. Obviously, she had no idea how brief that future would be. Dressed in a semi-diaphanous, pale daffodil yellow gown, the first wife, Elisabetta, who was Viennese, looked nothing like her replacement, who felt guilty for thinking that the yellow gown was something she wouldn't be caught dead in. Physically, they were opposites. She was small and quick and dark. Her husband was a pragmatic man. He knew the odds against finding the same thing twice, just as he knew how common it was to make the same mistake. For a hard-hearted businessman, he was surprisingly superstitious, though for all she knew, they all were. That was the sort of thing you couldn't ask the other wives on the museum boards. Will your husband walk under a ladder? Is he afraid of black cats? The walls of the room where the first wife's portrait hung were upholstered in dark cerulean blue silk. The painting was theatrically lit, and the room was otherwise empty except for an easy chair facing the portrait, a comfortable chair in which her husband sat to contemplate his loss. The door to that room was kept locked, though no one kept her out. The servants had the key. All she had to do was ask. She'd been in the room only once, just long enough for the dead wife's face to be imprinted on her memory. Of course, she thought of Bluebeard with all those murdered wives locked away in the castle, but her husband had loved his wife. He hadn't killed her. She died in childbirth, and the baby died along with her. It was the sort of thing that never happened anymore, certainly not in this city, this neighborhood, overseen by the celebrity obstetrician in the well-regarded hospital in which her husband and the first wife misguidedly placed their trust. When her husband said he wanted to commission their portrait, she agreed on the condition that it wouldn't be done by whoever painted his first wife. At first he looked annoyed, then hurt, then he understood. No, he said, he would never do that. It would be bad luck. Given the sort of portrait her husband had in mind, it made sense that the painter he hired should seem to come from an earlier era. Her husband had heard from some friends at his club that the wives all liked this guy's work. Even the wives who collected contemporary art had a soft spot for the painter who was academically trained in some old country or other, and who painted in the style of the old masters, or, if the client preferred, like Whistler or Sargent. At first, he'd agreed to paint the portraits of wealthy children, but he no longer had to, and he stopped. The painter was even older than her husband. She couldn't tell how old he was. Dark purple tinted glasses hid his eyes. A strange choice for a painter. He must have been used to people wondering about his glasses, because the first thing he said in his slight, unplaceable foreign accent was that he'd grown sensitive to light, a tragedy for a painter. He was tiny, elfin. She liked where this was going. Rumpelstiltskin was painting their portrait. I gave the painter my glasses.
I was wondering if that was the case.
Yeah.
But not the Rumpelstiltskin like.
Not the well. I hope not.
I want to go to where that reading began, to the sudden presence of this dead wife who's even in death is kind of locked away in this room, behind locked door and key. And although, yeah, she can be accessed, that idea that somehow the husband, rather than sort of, mourning her publicly, has chosen to kind of actually do the traditional sort of, fairy tale villain type thing. And, it's like he has two different women locked away to a certain degree, right? He has the living wife, in her opulence and wealth, and then the memory of the dead wife locked away.
Yeah. I mean, sure. I mean, I was noticing when I was reading this, it suddenly occurred to me that I'm kind of obsessed by Rumpelstiltskin, by that story. Yeah. I don't know, but it keeps. I mean, I thought of it only because I've been finishing a novel, and my editor said to me, did you notice that you mentioned Rumpelstiltskin like 5 or 6 times in the novel? And the novel has nothing to do with Rumpelstiltskin, believe me. And so I started thinking about, what it is, and by extension, the way in which fairy tales inform the way we think about our lives or something. And I was thinking about, the idea of spinning the straw into gold is this completely impossible task. And maybe it's a metaphor for what all of us are trying to do all the time. I mean, spinning straw into gold, what better description of trying to write is there?
There's a question from Jonathan Becker. The painter is a paradox. He makes and brings the wife in on the joke, but he's also very old school. Wives of friends at the club recommend him. So where does he fit in the story? He represents in some ways the opposition to the populace of the husband and his ignorance, but is also ensconced in that milieu.
Well, he's, again, a lot of things in the story, or everything in the story, or in many stories, they're not what anybody planned or had in mind. So whatever the husband thought the painter was, and whatever the wife thought the painter was, something completely happens. Something completely different happens. So sure, the painter comes from the old school, and in fact, part of that. I mean, I was thinking about it. We know painters who grew up in Russia, who were classically trained painters. So they're still existing, who have become modern artists. So they're still around. So the wife thinks that she and the painter are in on this joke together, and the husband is not in the joke. But in fact, by the end of the story, something else has happened.
Yeah.
The wife and the painter are kind of not in on. Something more magical and more unpredictable has occurred. So it's, again, it's like taking the plot or the joke or and just turning it and keep turning it and turning it again. So that, again, that was part of the fun of these narratives, because it's very hard to do that when you're writing about sort of a straight up novel about contemporary life. I mean, that is, plot turns more often wind up in mysteries or thrillers or something. But to do a contemporary story in which the plot keeps turning the way it does in like Kleist or something like that, there are these turns. That was part of the joy of it. And again, because it was liberating, I was able to do that.
Yeah. What if, I was curious also about the grief then that sort of perhaps like buried away there, right? If the husband and the wife and all of their sort of material wealth, the idea that I wonder if part of why they're so determined, why he's so determined to keep that sort of memory or that sort of image locked away, right? Is because there's almost a way in which grief or sort of loss doesn't exist or shouldn't exist in their reality, that they've amassed enough wealth or enough power where suddenly they should almost be inoculated to these things.
Yeah, it's locked in a room. And also the question of whether he's superstitious or not keeps kind of recurring through the
Yeah.
story, because whether or not he is, something really weird happens by the end of the story. So he might as well be, or anyone might as well be, because again, it's so unpredictable. And I don't know what the word is, surreal or magical, even though, within the context of something that's very, a story that has Jeff Koons in it. I mean, you know.
But even those superstitions, though, they also feel like they echo the idea that some things sort of reside beyond our control, right? And for somebody who's a finance analyst guy, whatever this the sort of way this man sort of imagines making himself to be, to acknowledge that superstition, right, is almost also dangerously acknowledge this other thing that you can't control.
Right.
And there's got to be a fear or an anxiety deeply buried in that.
Oh yeah, and also I think so much. I mean, it just so happens that at this point, I know a number of rich art collectors, and for them, art is so much about control. I mean, that is, you pay for it and you
Yeah.
pay a certain amount of money, and you know what you're getting, and it's a product like any other product, and you assume that the value of this product is going to go up with time like any other investment. And it's also a kind of social statement. You walk into somebody's house and you see a Jeff Koons on the wall, and this person's got X amount of money. So those were all the sort of things, as you said, that I was playing with in the story. I mean, the idea that emotions can be kept at bay and grief can be kept at bay, and that you have a kind of control by what you can pay for and what you're hiring and what you're not hiring, what you're contracting for. And then some other thing comes in like blam and just blows that all out of the equation.
Yeah. But is that sort of also what the artist does then? I mean, is the artist the sort of thing that literally kind of, he's like the mischievous character. He comes in, to go back to Jonathan's question, he feels like he belongs in this role, but he's also kind of there to cause a little chaos.
Do you mean this artist or the artist, capital?
Both this
This,
artist and actually the capital
right,
artist.
the
But
capital
even
artist. Yeah, I mean, again, it's like, I mean, I'm sure you've had the experience of writing something. And I mean, to me, it's been one of the most extraordinary things about working or doing any kind of art is you do something and you think like, where did that come from? Or, you invent a character and 2 weeks later you meet that person, or there's some strange interface between what you've imagined and what happens. In fact, Muriel Sparks' wonderful novel, Lord with Intent, is all about that. I mean, the young woman is just making up this stuff, and it turns out to have happened to other people. So I wanted that in there, and that, I mean, that is what happens by the end is something that no one in the story could have predicted or did predict. And finally, the artist has no more idea about why it happened than anyone else.
yeah.
In the way that you don't. I mean, like, I planned to do this, and then this happened.
Which it makes me think of Van Eyck, in painting, sort of doing this really immaculate portrait of this couple, and then suddenly once he begins to create that mirror, right, that mirror sort of disturbs and disrupts everything
Right.
that seems so organized and so kind of controlled in that painting, and suddenly your eyes forced to sort of zoom into this point that resides just beyond the distance.
Yeah, I mean, and the way, the way that people traditionally talk about art or art criticism, which I never quite understand about picture planes and so forth and fourth walls and whatever. I mean, that mirror totally breaks it. I mean, suddenly you're inside the painting in a strange way. And again, that was, I mean, all the stories in this little collection that have been good are all about art being controlled by something else that's not necessarily the artist. I mean, that, again, writing about the first or trying to imagine the first cave painting, where did that come from? Where did it possibly be? And someone said, oh, it'd be really helpful if you painted these bison on the wall because maybe it would be like good for the hunt or something. So, it always had, or really always had, this kind of magical element, which we've just moved away from, but maybe not so much.
Yeah. And I wonder if also part of the commodification of art, right? The idea that you can sort of buy it and pay for it and control it, is the way we also sort of render it less dangerous, less disruptive, right? And once we make it into, a commodity that we
Yeah.
invite into our homes.
You start creeping it out, you just sell it.
Yeah. So question from Rebecca. You mentioned earlier there being something freeing about writing not as yourself. Do you think the obsession with Rumpelstiltskin could be connected to the power of namelessness? Namelessness.
What does Rebecca mean? I mean, namelessness, you mean because the girl in this, the girl in Rumpelstiltskin has no name, as far as I know. She's just the miller's daughter or something, right? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I just think about it. I mean, Rumpelstiltskin is also a story about people having weird attachments to things, and a story about children. I mean, because the deal is that she gives up her first child in return for being able to do this, magical feat or whatever she does. So, it's something also I think that you think about if you're trying to make art and live in the world and have a family, is what, okay, I get to spin straw into gold, but what does that have to do with the rest of my life?
Yeah. I'm wondering if also Rebecca's question doesn't, the fact that everyone in the story remains nameless with the exception of the dead wife, Elspeth, right? And
Mm-hmm.
she's the one who actually, at the end of the story, unexpectedly actually contains or sort of has the most power. Rumpelstiltskin, it's his story at the end of the day. And his power is derived from the fact that no one knows his name.
Right. Yeah, no, but the story is called Rumpelstiltskin and not the, not the
And not
miller's
the name.
daughter. And Rumpelstiltskin is the name we remember, right?
Yeah.
But again, I wanted the husband and the wife to have a character and be vague at the same time, because the other thing about the Van Eyck painting is it's so sharp and it's so clear and the image is so definite. And then and what the husband wants is kind of vagueness, the ether of the 1%. So what he's after and what he gets and then what he really gets, I wanted those things all kind of to clash against one another.
Do you how self-aware is this couple? I know the wife thinks of herself as being fairly clever because she catches the relationship, but I was wondering if in recreating themselves and unknowingly as these sort of characters from this Van Eyck painting, there isn't a way in which they're rendered less original or less they're almost banal in a certain way, right? Because they're not as yes, they might be privileged, but there's nothing quite so special about them, right? They're kind of almost recreating and performing roles that have been around since the 15th century of just wealth.
Yeah, I mean, it's for sure, and also the fact that the costumes they're encouraged to put on are for some fundraising gala benefit that some Renaissance fair kind of fundraising thing. So, and also you can imagine that the husband and the wife in the story are not quite as good looking as Jan Arnolfini and his wife. I mean,
Yeah.
they're certainly much older, that's for sure, certainly the wife. So there's this disconnect between what happens. But the thing is, if the painter had only given them their portrait as the Arnolfinis, the story wouldn't have been interesting to me,
Yeah.
because so what, you know? But the fact that something else happens, that the presence of the dead wife makes itself felt through the portrait beyond the will of the painter, beyond the will of the wife, and certainly beyond the will of the husband, that was the thing that again got me into being interested in the story.
Are they? Do you see them as being disconnected from just? I mean, because it's almost like they're disconnected from a certain type of reality, right? Like back in the idea what you were sort of saying about their costumes that they wear. You know, they have these Renaissance costumes because they went to a fundraiser for Syrian orphans. You know, and there's something horrifyingly kind of garish about that idea of sort of dressing up this way in order, and even the way they sort of use money for art, right? Like her husband doesn't care what's on the painting of a museum, but he'll write the checks so his wife can be on the board.
Yeah, you know, I mean, actually, until you said it, of course I knew it earlier. Until you said it, it kind of didn't occur to me that the Arnolfinis were really rich. I don't know why. You know, I just thought, well, they're just people that have nice clothes in this room. But but once you start thinking that way, the possibility of vulgarity in the Van Eyck
Yeah.
painting raises its ugly, literally ugly head, the way it does in the story. I mean, it's like, what can money buy? Money can buy an image of me in a certain way that I choose to see it.
Yeah, and that's why, you know, within one of the things I sort of, when looking back at the Van Eyck painting that I kind of loved was the idea that he's kind of, you know, spitting on that idea, right? By, you know, there they are with all the sort of opulence, and yet his name is the one that's kind of sitting smack in the
Yeah.
center of the portrait. And even in that mirror, you know, we notice them, but we're almost called away into the distance almost as soon as we look, or even before we notice their expressions.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that he did it and then Velasquez did it. Like, you know, I mean, you imagine, I, if you can, you imagine both those painters thinking, can I do this? Or, you
Yeah.
know, am I going to be able to get away with this? Which is another, you know, very basic thing, I think, with making any kind of art. And then just being unable not to do it. And there they are in the mirrors in the painting.
There's a question from Kathy. Um, in the painting, the wife is pictured in a way that might suggest a transaction. In your story, the young wife's fate is set by whatever old school agreement her husband and father had come to concerning her future. That stopped me when I read it. It sounds like Van Eyck's time, not now.
Yeah, it does sound like Van Eyck's time and not now. I'm, you know, that, that was intentional. I mean, and I think it still goes on. I mean, I think it still goes on, not in the completely transactional way of, you know, here, take my daughter so the line will continue, blah, blah, blah. But in other ways, you know, you grow up in a certain family, you're expected to make a certain kind of marriage. And that, I think, I mean, the story is much more direct about that, I think it's not completely from the 15th century. Or, I
Yeah,
mean, we haven't left it back in the 15th century necessarily.
yeah. It's sort of, you know, it takes a slightly harder twist on that, but the idea of, you know, she knows, you know, when the young men are coming, the painter's assistants, and they're unpacking the boxes, and she sees them looking at her, and they know that she's made a compromise, right? Like a price, some exchange has been made. Here she is, young and beautiful, you know, sort of married to this man, and it's to acknowledge, I think, a certain very real reality that it might not be quite as extreme as the Van Eyck time or the 15th century, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a commodification happening.
Oh yeah. No, the story is so much about art and money and that relation. And then all these other kind of less, you know, more magical things that happen in the process of making art that just completely disrupt the ickier but neater relation between art and money.
Sorry, about the sort of within the kind of nameless nature of these characters, right? If they, did you sort of worry that you were pillaring them too much while you were sort of creating them? Did you want to like try to find a way to make the husband,
A
you
human
know,
being.
that's really a
Why
human
would
being.
I? But no, I mean, but also, a fairy tale liberates you in a certain way. I mean, writing a fairy tale does, because the characters in fairy tales, they're not necessarily three-dimensional in the way that we expect characters in contemporary fiction to be. They are the miller and the miller's daughter and Rumpelstiltskin. I mean, who knows what his issues were really. So there's a kind of an appeal to me. I mean, it's not, I couldn't write a novel like that, but writing these stories, what I liked in a way was being able to have the kind of flatness of the characters that you have in fairy tales, and not feel the compulsion to give them dimensionality or even depth, really. I mean, why?
And that renders them though interesting, right? Because then they become subject to different types of pressures, right? Like they're not, if when they sort of have to do this sort of full three-dimensional like novel like portrait, then that question of sort of agency and their sort of own involvement. And here that agency is not that just necessarily stripped away, but it's almost like something is always happening or taking place outside of their control or even sort of knowledge, right? They think, this painter's coming in to paint a normal portrait. The wife thinks that it's going to be a kind of like mocking narrative around related to Arnolfinis, but something keeps sort of happening that they're not aware of.
Yeah. Well, when you write a real novel that's not a fairy tale, you're constantly up against questions of plausibility or more motivation, or would someone do this in real life, or whatever. But once you move into the realm of something more, let's say, fantastic, a lot of that can drop away, and what you're looking at is action. I mean, the story I keep returning to is Kleist's The Marquise of O, because it's one plot turn after another, and you never quite understand why anybody's doing anything they do, because it doesn't make any sense from any standpoint of anything about human behavior. But it's the most beautiful thing ever. So I was sort of working towards something like that, where, hoping that the narrative would reveal something about character in a way in which we're used to getting from the depth of character themselves.
Yeah, yeah. I was interested in the way the characters don't know their own vulnerabilities, like that they don't know the kind of possibility of something sort of mysterious happening. Um, there's I'm sorry. There's a request for us to speak a little bit more, to slow down.
Oh,
Um, we get excited.
okay. Sorry,
Uh,
I'm really sorry. I just get carried away.
but the idea that the characters, when I was thinking about that, when the painter comes into their house and he is automatically struck by the room, that where all the sort of walls and furnitures have come from, not yeah, from Antwerp, right?
Hmm.
That even though these characters don't know that from that moment on, they're going to play a different type of role than the one they expect, because suddenly now they're already characters in this other story that's taking place in the painter's mind. They're now connected to this Van Eyck portrait, whether they know it or not.
Yeah. I mean, also the husband has imported this fancy woodwork from Antwerp just because it kind of looks good,
Yeah.
but you're right, once it has a significance of the painting. I mean, also, there are real things that keep coming in, and I mean, I mentioned giving the painter my glasses, but I was thinking very particularly of Rubens's house in Antwerp, which I went to years ago. Has those walls, looks that way, looks as if the Van Eyck painting could have been painted inside it. So it's fun to kind of have these pictures in your head while you're writing, especially if you're writing about pictures.
When you began this painting, did you ever? Because when you first told me the idea of the story, I started reading it, I almost was expecting just by default that the story would reimagine these characters, right? That rather than setting the story in contemporary Manhattan and New York, that in fact I would be reading Francine Prose imagining, the life of a wealthy Viennese couple in Antwerp or in Bruges in the 15th century, but you went a totally different route. And I was wondering if you knew that from the beginning, or if, yeah.
Well, each of the stories that I've been doing has been set in a different time period. And that kind of interests me. But I had already done one. I mean, the first story that I did for them was about a guy, a painter, a Renaissance painter, who goes to Naples. His specialty is painting clouds. That's what he does. He's a painter of clouds, like Tiepolo. That's what he does. He paints clouds. So, and clouds has become kind of the fashion for dining rooms of rich people in Naples. And so he goes to Naples and he can paint anything, but it turns out that he can't paint clouds. I mean, every cloud he tries to paint just turns out wrong, and he can't. So the story sort of starts from there. So I really knew that I didn't want to do another story in that time because I want to, but in some ways it's sort of the same thing, because something happens that's unpredictable, where the art takes on a life of its own, or the art tells him what he can do and what he can't do. And by the end of the story, something very strange has happened about agency, about who makes the art. So they all have this sort of same. Oh, and also, the story about the photographer, the war children photographer, winds up being about Grimm's fairy tales, actually, because she's adopted this child who has this strange gift, which is the child is autistic, but the child can hold up a book of Grimm's fairy tales next to her head and draw a completely beautiful painting of an illustration of a Grimm's fairy tale. Strange, but it happens in the story. So, and each one of those stories is about some unpredictability connected with art, some other thing that happens.
Maybe now would be a good time to go. You want to do one more reading?
Yeah. Let's see. I'll just read from what I left off. The first thing he asked, after a glass of water, please, no ice, this is the painter, was that their heavy drapes be drawn, obscuring their panoramic view of Central Park, which she had secretly hoped might appear in the background, even though she knew that, in the kind of portrait her husband wanted, they could be anywhere, nowhere, floating in ether in clouds. Her husband should have hired Tiepolo if he'd known who Tiepolo was, and didn't mind that Tiepolo had been dead for hundreds of years. She knew better than to tell an artist, even this artist, what to do. He'd already told him he couldn't bear the bright light, the drapes were pulled. Then the painter decided that the electric lights were the wrong color. He said, I'm thinking something more golden. Golden sounded right to her husband. By the time the painter returned for their second meeting, all the bulbs had been replaced with amber bulbs. In the golden light, she and her husband followed the painter from room to room. Jittery and distracted, he slammed in and out of every room except the locked one in which the dead wife's portrait hung. At last, he reached the wood-paneled library, imported by her husband, mahogany shelf by mahogany shelf, burled walnut panel by burled walnut panel from a defunct gentleman's club in Antwerp. The painter stood in the doorway. Perfect, he said. Then he turned and left the apartment.
I was thinking, but the fact that these characters never leave the house, really. That they're almost sort of trapped in their own little, Central Park gazing palace. Here they are, sort of at the top of the world in a certain way, but they're never able. We never actually see them sort of moving through the world.
Well, they're 41 stories up in the air.
Yeah.
I mean, they're literally in the clouds. The clouds. I mean, the other thing I was thinking about, and as I was reading this, is I wanted to write about the breathing, and in fact, it kind of runs through all the stories except for the cave painting story, about the relationship between, well, as I said, between money and art, but also the way in which rich art collectors are at once in awe, awed by, intimidated by the artist, and yet want their money's worth from the artist. So that's also kind of running through the story and a number of the stories.
Yeah, there's a moment where they say that they're putting themselves in the artist's hands, and she sort of wonders why she sort of says that. But there's a real almost sort of temporary transference of kind of agency and power in that. That as soon as the painter, and even the way he moves through the house in the scene you just sort of described, right? Like he goes around slamming things, and kind of dictating to them like what things are going to look like, which says a lot about also just the sort of own the idea of authenticity in their lives. That suddenly this man can kind of come in and sort of recreate their world any way that he sees fit, and they're not going to do a thing about it.
Yeah, he's the artist. He's the artist. I mean, again, if you go to ever like those dinners that are after art openings, and you watch this weird little dance that goes on, because the thing about art, apparent, in the Renaissance is now, it's not, we can write a book and anyone who has 15.99 can get it or take it out of the library. But a painting can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So certainly since Van Eyck's time or before, I guess the church was in there, but there was a relationship and is a relationship between the 1% and the artist that's very, very complicated and nuanced and shifting.
Do you think that power derives from the I guess, yeah, is it because of the value of the possibility of having something that's sort of worth money? I'm just trying to help sort of locate where the authority that the artist, where the agency that the artist has, or the sort of power that the artist is able to sort of exude comes from, right? And to some degree, they should actually be, considerably more dependent upon the wealth. But in fact, there are ways in which the artist and the wealth, sort of like that dynamic, actually flips around, because there's something that the wealth needs from the artist, right? There's something that it hopes or is sometimes seeking that the artist will deliver it or deliver to it.
Yeah, I mean, the artist has a skill, we assume. I mean, a skill, and also kind of glamour. And part of the transaction is that is is that in return for money, some of that glamour rubs off on the collector, right? I mean, but of course, no one can predict what happens in the story, which is that the image of the dead wife, which the painter has never seen, neither the wife nor the image, appears in the final painting instead of the image of the living wife who's been part of the commission of the painting. I mean, where is that coming from? It's just, that was kind of the turn that I wanted the story to take, and the thing that well, it's the thing that for me raised it above the various social critique elements of the story and turned it into a story about art again, because that magical thing that happens.
Yeah, but it's almost an attempt to perhaps try to strip that magical thing of the art from the art itself, right? The idea that we want the art to reflect something back to us, right? That we both sort of know and perhaps can control, or something that we feel like we have a participation in. That that idea, and maybe that's where some of the authority that the artist has derives from that sort of need. But in fact, the power that the artist has, or the existence of art, can only come from the fact that it doesn't perform that way, right? That it doesn't actually succumb to the sort of demands or wishes of the patrons or of the wealthy.
Yeah, I mean, there are all these stories in art history of the person who commissioned the portrait not liking how the portrait turned out, even though, surprise, the portrait probably turned out looking exactly like the person who commissioned it, but
Yeah.
not how the person imagined the person in the person's head. So there's some of that too. I mean, the way in which vanity and fantasy figure into this transaction as well.
There's a question. Why has the second wife never met her husband's family, and why is she forbidden from seeing her siblings?
Because again, I was trying to create in some strange way, and the person who said this is from another century in a way was dead on. I was trying to create a, a sense of something that could have happened at another time that didn't feel exactly modern. But also that, why has she never met the family? Because the family is not the family that the husband is pretending to be the family. I mean, that's part of it. And why is she prevented from seeing her siblings? Because she's essentially been bought the way wives were bought in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and so forth. And she's been bought from a certain place and brought to someplace else and installed in this world. And she thinks that this painting is her way, her little joke on the world.
The I was thinking of sort of doppelganger-like quality that this couple has to the sort of Van Eyck, to the couple in the Van Eyck painting. Um, but maybe sort of also move a little bit forward into the story, the kind of switch that begins to happen, the sort of the way the painting begins to kind of actually materialize into something that um, that isn't in control of them or the artist. Is how did you come up with that idea that the dead wife's sort of ghost would actually, I don't know, take over the painting, take over, or assert her presence somehow?
That was pretty much from the beginning. I had that pretty much from the beginning because that's why I had her portrait locked away in that room. I mean, why is it necessary that, aren't there locked room mysteries? It's like a locked room. I mean, why was it necessary that the painter never saw that portrait? Because he's slamming through the apartment, right? And he's going in and out of all the doors, but not that one room. So we need to know from the beginning that he never sees that picture. So that when that image, I mean, I suppose if this were the real world, it's easy enough these days to Google the husband and find an image of the first wife, but he does. Yeah, I don't think he does. I think it just appears. He says he doesn't know how it appeared on the canvas. There's a famous Indian story that I think about all the time where some guy painter was painting these pictures of Krishna and Radha at play in the fields, and he was stuck and he couldn't do it and he couldn't do it, and he went to like bathe in the river, and by the time he came back, the wife said, "Oh, you're still here," and it turned out that Krishna had appeared in his house and just finished the painting of himself, the god. And I always think about that as this gigantically weird but accurate metaphor of what the process feels like. You go to take a nap and something appears and sits at your desk and types, and then you go back and you go, "Oh my God."
I was thinking too as of Joyce's The Dead and the sort of resurrection of Michael Fury kind of coming back, um, even though it's a very sort of different type of narrative, right? But the idea that the dead are sort of they're not going to be sort of locked away, that these things sort of can't be put into sort of corners and pretended like they didn't sort of happen, or that they can only be sort of treated when we want to, but that in fact that they're going to come back as they sort of see fit.
Yeah. Do you believe in ghosts?
Um, I sometimes do, right? I do believe that there's something that doesn't resolve so cleanly at death. That there's something that continues to sort of linger in ways that don't cohere to what we sort of want the world to cohere to. I don't know if that means a ghost or not.
Yeah.
Um,
No, that's how I feel too. But also so many, in the course of a single lifetime, so many experiences occur that, if you were a believer in the occult, which I'm actually not, it would almost make you one because they're inexplicable. How did someone know something about something, et cetera, et cetera. They happen all the time. So, but the challenge is to put them in a story and not make it seem ridiculous.
yeah,
So,
which maybe in the very sort of opening paragraph of this story, um, with the weasels, the weasels armed with box cutters who surround, clutching their paws, sprawled about, asleep on the ground like the soldiers guarding the tomb of Jesus. And when I first read that, I was like, what's Jesus doing here with these weasels? And then later on, I was like, oh, of course, there's resurrection there.
Yeah, well, you know those paintings. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, those paintings where all the soldiers are just like lying there on the ground and like, whoops, you know. But the idea of making them weasels, I don't know where the weasels came from, but it was one of those moments that just made me so happy
Yeah.
when you know. But you know, I have this thing. Well, you probably can't see it. I have this little plastic skull I wear that's just plastic, and sometimes I pretend that it's a ferret skull. So those kinds of creatures are never that far from my consciousness.
I was also reading up on weasels in sort of, Renaissance paintings, and there's a wonderful painting of Louis XIV in this sort of cape that's made almost entirely of ermine. Um,
Really?
and so, depending upon which tradition you were sort of looking at, in some they were considered sort of, mischievous, pesky rodents. In others, they were also seen as a sign of luxury and sort of wealth, because they wouldn't go, especially the white weasels, they wouldn't go into dirty places. They wouldn't sully themselves.
Uh-huh.
So they could also be seen as, fairly elite, sort of snotty little creatures, depending upon who wanted them. So,
Well, you know, because I have such a big garden, and because I'm at war for 4 months a year with chipmunks and hedgehogs and woodchucks and so forth, I really think I do think of them as predators. So that kind of influenced the way I thought about those weasels in the beginning of the story.
uh, so I want to go working our way back towards the sort of end of the narrative, when the painting is sort of revealed, right? That's the sort of, kind of the big, sort of dum moment, and we don't know what's going to happen. But I definitely didn't expect that it was going to turn out okay, you know. But that it wouldn't be a
Yeah, I know.
story.
Right. Oh, we love the painting. It's so beautiful. I'm so happy to see my head and my wife's head on the Van Eyck's body. No, no. But also because there's something so simultaneously beautiful and creepy about that painting, I think. I mean, maybe there are people who think it's just beautiful, but I don't know how they could. I mean, there's some edge of creepiness about it. I wanted that I wanted that creepiness to be thrumming under the surface, not that far under the surface throughout the story, so that I don't think you would imagine I mean, the minute you have a dream about the weasels lying around the tomb of Jesus, I don't think you're expecting a happy ending.
Yeah.
I, I mean, I wouldn't be.
The husband's reaction to it, he there, it's the first time we actually see, a semblance of sort of human emotion coming out of him, where he's not just barking orders, at least temporarily. And he actually sort of, right, her husband was crying. His wife's face wasn't her face. The wife in the painting wasn't her. um is he, what is his grief real there? Did you imagine it to be real?
Yeah, yeah. And also the thing that had been locked away uh, in the room had suddenly escaped from the room in a strange way. So yeah, I thought it was real.
Yeah.
I
And
mean, he
what's
wasn't crying because he didn't get his money's worth. Something else had happened.
but also think that, what's the reason why the room is locked away, right? It's maybe perhaps not just, um, because out of a sense of sort of power or control, but if that was maybe where there's sort of only one real experience of love that he did have, right? That
Yeah,
idea of actually keeping it very private. It suddenly turns that what was at first a very problematic relationship to the dead wife, and the idea that he could just put her into a room and sit in front of a chair, into something that suddenly becomes a bit more actually tender, and sort of tragic, both for him and his second wife now.
hmm yeah, yeah. No, it's private. I mean, that's the whole point of it. That room is private, and everything that goes on in that room is private. But I was always also thinking about all those. When I was a kid, all those stories like Rebecca, and to a certain extent Jane Eyre, where there's the either the dead wife is very present and et cetera, or Jane Eyre where she's up in the attic screaming. That's sort of it's like a 19th century, early 20th century trope added on to this Renaissance trope added on to this modern trope. So I was kind of squished them all together.
And the second wife, though, she seems, describe her reaction, because she seems pretty okay after a certain degree.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't exactly what she thought was going to happen, but you know, but you don't get much of her reaction because soon after that in the story, the husband dies, and her response is, you know, is just to want to get rid of both of those paintings, just out. So, but the genius of sending them to the dead wife's family, and then again, you know, the dead wife's family saying, "Oh, she always wanted a dog like the dog in the painting." What I was doing or trying to do was doing that, just doing plot turns.
Yeah.
You know, just doing plot turns, like turning it and turning it and turning it the way, you know, just that way that we can hardly do anymore in fiction. We just can't. It's not because it's not naturalistic, I guess. But there's something that, you know, it's why we love fairy tales so much. I mean, there's something about us that we want that kind of turn in the narrative. I mean, when you're telling stories to kids, they want plots to turn in that way. And I think it's some basic desire about hearing a story that we wanted. I mean, I still want it. I go back. I read Hans. I've taught the Snow Queen several times. It's Hans Christian Andersen. It's really fun to teach because it's so crazy, and the plot is just all over the place. And also, one of the things I love about the Snow Queen is, I think it's the greatest example in literature of a work of art that does exactly the opposite of what you know the artist intended. I mean, you know, Anderson wanted to do this cute little story about these little children singing stories about God in the sunlight, and he wound up with the dirtiest, most erotic, crazy. You know? So there you go.
It was sort of, you know, almost what the painter wanted to. Like he wanted to create a sort of recreation of the sort of classical Jan Van Eyck painting, and in fact, he ends up with something completely else, right? Something that he couldn't have even imagined or sort
Yeah.
of conceived of as happening.
Mm-hmm.
Where the art even sort of resides, it becomes this thing that takes place, or that sort of supersedes the artists themselves, right? It actually resides beyond their control.
Well, that's the mystery of doing it. And that's the hardest thing to talk about because it just sounds so, you know, woo, woo, woo. But I think anyone who's tried to do it has had, you know, particularly where narrative is involved, has had that experience of something that you didn't predict or something that you felt not in your control working its way onto the novel, into the novel, or onto the canvas, or what, you know, into the piece of music, whatever you do.
Reminds me of the, you know, the Flannery O'Connor sort of idea of mystery, right? Of wanting to write stories that had a deeper type of realism, one that resides just beyond the surface of the ordinary. And that idea that stories aren't there to kind of condense or sort of collapse our understanding of the world, but to kind of, as you said at the end, just continually pivot and sort of turn and kind of remind us of the sort of logical nature of the world rather than the reasonable and rational.
Yeah. Well, Flannery O'Connor had it easier in a way because she was a real believer, a real
Yeah.
believer. So she knew what the mystery was or what the mysteries were. She knew they were very particular. But we've kind of got to make them up on our own because we don't have, they're not given to us in that same way.
Yeah. But it seems, but maybe, I guess maybe I would almost argue that you're actually saying that, you know, rather than the normal channels of faith, right, that you actually find it in the aesthetic, that the art actually becomes the repository of the mysterious, of the kind of, you know, sublime, of the ineffable, the things that can't be, you know, located or sort of, you know, controlled.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I hate the word process, you know, because of what's your process is like, ugh. But it's part of the process. I think it's some very particular part of the process where you just, well, you know, the metaphor I used to think of, and still do, is as taking dictation. I mean, a character starts talking, and the character will say things that you really hadn't expected that character to say. And, it sounds like a cliche because everybody says it and blah, blah, blah. But it happens. It happens all the time. You just start them going and they talk and you're listening. Well, you know I mean, I assume you know what I'm talking about, right? You're just listening. So and it's moving through you. And sometimes, you'll read a book and you'll feel that something was like channeling through the writer. You'll just feel that sense that something, was moving through the writer. And I think that's what we're all working toward. I mean, that sense of something, I don't know, beyond us, it's moving us towards something we want to do.
Did you have that feeling when writing this story?
This story? Yeah. I mean, that's you want to surprise yourself, I think, in the same way you want to. I don't know, some days, if I write a line that makes me laugh, I'll just quit for the day. I'm done. It's like, so I've done enough for that day. And that same way, just like, the joy of writing a plot turn that surprises you, you weren't expecting it to go that way, or something happened, or you don't know where it came from. That's heaven.
Yeah. I was surprised, how much also I smiled and laughed throughout the story, right? Like it felt while reading it that you also had fun.
It was super fun. It was super fun. But all these stories were fun, again, because I was freed from, even more. I mean, another great thing about writing is that you're not yourself. You're some other thing. But in this, nameless. Nameless. But I was really, because I didn't think anyone I knew was going to read it. It gave me another kind of freedom.
Yeah. If there are any more questions from the audience before we start to begin to sort of wrap this out. I thought maybe we could sort of, if there aren't any more questions, just sort of conclude maybe with just one final reading from just the last page, maybe.
The end of the story? Why not do that?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so they've been waiting on the painting and waiting and waiting and waiting, and the husband's about to cancel the contract and blah, blah, blah. And finally the painter shows up with the painting. His assistant gently pulled off the velvet cloth. It was the Arnolfini portrait, the room, the mirror, the wooden chest, the patterned rug, the red canopied bed. There was Twitchy, the little dog, his image not only lifelike, but conveying his bright spirit, his intelligence, his speedy desire to please. She took back every negative thought she'd had about the dog man instead. Oh, there's a dog man who was a dog wrangler. There's a dog wrangler who helps. Right. She looked at the couple last. Just then she heard a peculiar sound coming from her husband, and she turned to see that he was snorting back tears. Only then did she look at the couple, their hands joined, the husband in stocking feet. For a moment she was distracted by a keening that turned into the singing of the weasel beggars in her dream. Sugar and meat and corn and meat. Tinnitus, she'd heard it before, ringing in her ears. There was nothing her doctor could do. Sometimes stress brought it on. It always disappeared on its own. Her husband was crying. The wife's face wasn't her face. The wife in the painting wasn't her. Blonde, blue-eyed, malleable, trusting. It was the face of her husband's dead wife. And the husband says, "You'll be hearing from my lawyer." But actually, said her husband, slamming the door on his way out. And then she asked the painter, how did he do it, and so forth. And then the husband is dissuaded by contacting his lawyer because someone tells him that, well, really, since Picasso, there's no expectation that a portrait will look like the person, so you can just give that one up.
One of the last things that I sort of loved is that the portrait of the dead wife is the exact opposite of her. She is small, dark, and definitely not trusting or innocent or malleable. She's the opposite of all of these things, and that's the image that comes back to haunt them.
Well, a number of things had to be set up to make it work. I mean, it had to be set up that the husband was very definitely not going to go after a replica of the first wife. And it had to be set up that the first wife looked entirely different than the second wife. Because just in terms of narrative, it wouldn't have worked if the second wife looked a lot like the first wife, so that you couldn't really tell which one was in the painting. You had to know
Yeah.
that the woman in the painting was not this image of the second wife.
Yeah. Well, if there are no more questions, I don't know if you have anything else you wanna note, Francine. Um,
So, do I see a little?
oh, that's
Oh,
just a,
thank you. No, that's fine. It's been fun.
it's been great talking to you. It's been wonderful having everyone. I always like turn my head as if this imaginary audience is going to somehow materialize. Please come back next week. We will be in conversation with our Professor Valeria Luiselli, who will be reading from and discussing her novel Lost Children Archives, I'm sure along with many other things. Thank you, Francine,
Thank you.
for joining us. It was a lot of fun. Thank you, everyone. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to write us, email us, and stay in touch. Stay safe, and bye-bye.
See you soon.